Hello! So I thought that I would make a video kind of wrapping up my 2023 language learning, specifically mostly for Spanish. And while prepping for this video, I thought, actually, I just want to make like a timeline of my Spanish learning. I am going into my 5th year of learning Spanish, so 4 years, and I just think that there's not enough discussion of how long things really take in language learning for most people. Obviously this varies hugely from person to person. There are people who reach a very high level of proficiency in languages, especially languages like Spanish, within a year. But that has not been the case for me, and I'm sure is not the case for many, many other people. So I don't have, as detailed of documentation as I do now in my learning for my entire Spanish learning experience, but I do have, somewhat of an advantage over most people in that I have had a YouTube channel for the majority of my language learning time. I was able to kind of crowdsource information from a lot of my different platforms and personal stuff to kind of try to reconstruct my Spanish learning. So anyway, if you're new here, hi, my name is Jo. My first real attempt in learning Spanish started at the very beginning of 2020. So I signed up for a community college online Spanish 1 course in spring of 2020. So from like January to probably May-ish, I was doing an online Spanish course. And so, that taught essentially normal Spanish 1 stuff, family, relationships, present tense, indicative conjugation, that sort of stuff, colors, numbers, things like that. I did not particularly enjoy this class, but I didn't hate it. I knew that I didn't really want to sign up for Spanish 2 though, just because I didn't love the style of learning. And so that's when I really started to research how to learn languages, started looking at stuff online, discovered like the language learning community online, which I did already know to some extent existed, but I started watching a lot more YouTube and that sort of thing. So over the summer, I kind of was watching a bit of stuff here and there, but I was having trouble seeing Spanish as fun. I think I was kind of overwhelmed, by how much I didn't know. So then, having watched a bunch of YouTube stuff and seen people talk about Lingota, I did do about 2 or 2.5 months of Lingota in the end of 2020. So I think October is when I started that. I don't have any problem with Lingota. I have done Lingota again since, but I don't really like speaking early, and so it wasn't really well suited to my learning style. It was more stressful than anything else, and honestly, I'm sure I gained things from, hearing the teacher speak and stuff, but I don't think I actually learned that much from that time period because, again, most of my time was either bored or highly stressed thinking about speaking. So then, 2021, the dawn of my YouTube channel. I started YouTube at the very beginning of 2021. And so my very first video, I think, was 2021 goals. So this video has been re-uploaded on this channel, so it will not say the beginning of 2021, but like the thumbnail and everything is. This was when I decided to start reading graphic novels. So that was a really huge thing. I finished my first few books, graphic novels physically, and that was so gratifying. They were incredibly difficult for me to read. I do have a video rereading the first graphic novel that I ever read in Spanish, so I will link that, and that talks about how like a book that it took me 4 weeks to read painstakingly, like 5 to 10 pages at a time, took me like an hour and a half to read 2 years later. So, it definitely was not a painless experience reading these, but it was very, very rewarding, and it was kind of the first time that I felt like maybe I could actually do this, but I did have trouble, sustaining that effort, and I kind of fell off of language learning over the summer. That whole year was very, very sporadic. Months where I did absolutely nothing, and then months where I did a couple days. I was definitely watching stuff occasionally over the summer, and I actually watched my first show that I felt like I could really understand, which was Altamar. I watched that mostly with Spanish subtitles, and then sometimes I would rewatch it with both subtitles if I felt like I really needed to know what was happening in an episode and I couldn't understand. But that was definitely the first show that I felt like I could actually really comprehend what was happening, mostly just because it's a very simple show, but still that was really exciting. And then the end of 2021 was the revolutionary period in my language learning. So I decided to solely focus on Spanish for some time. Prior to that, I had been trying to do German and Spanish. And in October and November, I read my first chapter book. Ended up reading 3 books in fairly rapid succession for how I was at the time. And in November, I did a challenge for myself where I tried to do an hour every single day, which was vastly just so much more than I had been doing previously. So, that really helped me get into a routine of doing things. Not that I felt the need to maintain a streak or anything like that, but the fact that it felt natural to every single day do some kind of Spanish immersion or whatever the case might be. So something that I mentioned at the end of that year in my 2021 wrap-up 2022 goals video was that I felt like if I had read a book only in Spanish, even a children's book, I did not feel like I had actually read it. Like I wouldn't feel like I would be able to give like a review of that book or give my like true opinion of it. So that's kind of a milestone that I will touch back on later. So for a 2021 wrap up, I read 8 books in Spanish, 5 of which were graphic novels, 3 of which were chapter books. I read 2 of the Narnia books and the Hunger Games. So moving into 2022, this is where the milestones start to get significantly more abstract. In April, I finished my first audiobook in Spanish, so something that I was solely listening to, not listening to and reading along. Another, fun random milestone. Somewhere around mid-2022, I started to understand memes. Obviously, occasionally I would have to look up a word, but even with sometimes non-standard spelling or a little bit more informal, I could understand simpler memes. Not all memes, but simpler ones. And I started to follow a lot more Spanish accounts on Instagram and that sort of thing. So then in late 2022, I would say at that point, I considered that children's books, middle grade, maybe some YA books, I would consider myself having read them, only having read them in Spanish. So like I was reading Los Dioses del Norte series, which it has not been translated, so there's literally no way, well, it has been translated but not into English, so there's no way that you could reread it in English, but nonetheless, I do feel like I had read that series and I felt like I could give a review of it. Mid to late 2022 that I started to feel that way about that age range of books specifically. In 2022, I read 31 books in Spanish, 16 of which were audiobooks only, which, despite my love and adoration for audiobooks and how integral they have been for my learning, that was a big thing for me to be able to listen to an audiobook only and feel like I was enjoying it. And I would say that skill developed somewhere, or that comfort level developed around the middle of 2022 as well. Yeah, I would not have felt comfortable listening to anything where I didn't know the story. Still, even knowing the story, it was very difficult to follow at times. There would be whole passages that would go by where I was like, I don't really know what they were saying there. So, it was kind of towards the middle of 2022 where I started feeling comfortable actually listening to audiobooks, simpler audiobooks that I hadn't read before. I'll put on the screen when the first one that I listened to solely that I hadn't read before, and it was, I believe it was Esperanza Renace or Esperanza Rising, and I felt like I understood that story. That was 2022. And then 2023, we are just fully into nebulous, abstract territory. On paper, there's not a huge amount of difference between 2022 and 2023. And even looking back myself, obviously I remember there being a difference, but to describe the difference is difficult because yeah, I read 31 books in 2022. I read 52 books in 2023, which is obviously significantly more, but, you know, I was able to read books and watch shows independently both of these years, and so it just doesn't really sound like that different, but obviously there are huge differences. So I'll just get into the nitty-gritty, the details on my 2023 wrap-up, because obviously it is the beginning of 2024, so it's very interesting to me, and also I actually have the data on this because I did keep quite detailed records, I guess you could say, of my 2023. So like I said, 52 books total, read and listened to, so at the same time listening to the audiobook and reading the book, 13 of those. I read only 7 of them. I audiobook only 27 of them, and 5 were graphic novels. 37 of those books were native Spanish books, or 36 depending on how you count them, but 36 to 37 of them were native Spanish books. I read from 5 countries: Chile, Argentina, Spain, Uruguay, and Mexico. For shows, I watched 27 seasons of television, which sounds horrifying, but you have to bear in mind that some of these seasons were like 3 episodes long, like mini series and that sort of thing. 4 countries: Spain, Mexico, Argentina, and Colombia. I watched 11 movies from 3 countries: Chile, Spain, and Mexico. I took 37 Spanish classes in 2023 because 2023 was the year that I resumed Spanish classes. So mostly just conversation classes online. So in the spring, I did a little bit of italki. So I did about 5 italki classes, 15 Langota classes, and 17 Babbel Live classes. You know, 2023 was the year basically that I resumed trying to speak in Spanish. I did, visit my first Spanish-speaking country this year. I'll be linking videos in the description that relate to these things as well. But yeah, it was a really, really, really great year. And so back to some of our milestones that we were checking in on. As far as feeling like I have read a book if I've only read it in Spanish, I think that is true for me now if I have read the book physically, and if it is not just wildly, wildly difficult. I would say the vast majority of books in Spanish, if I read it physically, I feel like I have read it. I don't think that's necessarily the case for audiobooks, but it depends on the type of book. If it's a YA book or a fairly simple kind of thriller, contemporary, relatively simple standard book, then I do think that I feel like I have read it if I've only listened to it in Spanish. If it is more of a literary book or a really, really complex plot, then I would say we're getting into iffy territory. There are books that I don't like to listen to as audiobooks in English also. There are books that I feel like are too complex or too flowery of language, too much detail, like classics. I really struggle to listen to classics because I struggle to pay attention. So, you have to bear in mind that there is some level of that built in no matter what the language is. But I do think specifically, yes, my level of Spanish prevents me from feeling that way on some books, for sure. Reading speed-wise, I mentioned, I believe at the very beginning of 2023, that I think it was Babbel, the Babbel books translated into Spanish, my reading speed was 2 pages per minute. No, I did it again. I did this in this video. 2 minutes per page. 1.5 to 2 minutes per page. My speed in the Los Dioses del Norte book that I was reading at the time, which is a middle grade fantasy with relatively large print, was 1 minute per page. And my reading speed has definitely increased. I think I was on 1.25 speed on the audiobook, which I mentioned at the time. Now, a book like that, I would probably be on 2 times speed in order to read along with the audiobook. I notice with Spanish books that when I start the book, I usually start on 1 time speed or maybe 1.25 times speed in order to keep pace with reading. But once I get more comfortable with the book, once I'm comfortable with the author's style, all the characters' names, the kind of vocabulary that the book is using, I I get the urge to speed up the audiobook as I progress through the book. So when I first started reading, I would really struggle to have the audiobook on 1x speed. I hate having it less than 1x speed because that makes the voice weird, but I would be pausing to kind of catch up, to look things up. So it took quite some time to feel comfortable at 1x speed. That was probably in 2022 sometime that happened. And then in 2023, we started to get to the point where 1x speed felt too slow. And this is hugely impacted by the fact that Spanish has the same alphabet and, all of that stuff. Like, that's a major factor in that, but just, for comparison's sake. I think this is where the idea of like intermediate plateau kind of factors in. I think it's Future Multilingual that just made a video about this recently, about how, this does not exist. Like, there is no plateau at which your learning slows down, which I think is, almost definitely true. It seems nonsensical that your learning would actually slow down, but I think it's your perception. You're not perceiving the changes, partially because of just mental biases that you have of thinking that things are staying the same. And also, the thing that I was just mentioning where 2020, I go from not being able to do anything in Spanish, pretty much, basic greetings, to 2021, I'm reading graphic novels at the beginning of the year, to 2022, I'm reading chapter books at the beginning of the year, 2023, I'm reading adult books that I haven't read before, 2024, we're going in, and it's kind of like nothing's going to change, 2020 through 2022, huge changes, 22 through 24, it's all a little bit more nebulous, there's nothing concrete that I'm like, I can do this now that I could not do before. So yeah, I think that's kind of where the perception comes in. But a few fun things that I have noticed, if I'm reading a book, especially a YA or middle grade book, sometimes I will be like reading along. I'll like screech to a halt dramatically at a word because I don't know it. And my brain will just be like, oh my God, there's a word you don't know. Whereas like before, or, now in any other languages that I'm trying to learn, that's like the norm. It's more like you screech to a halt when you see a word you know, and you're like, oh my God, I know that word. For several years now, I've been very accustomed to seeing words I don't know all the time. And my only mental sticking point there is, do I want to stop and look that up, or am I just going to let it go by? That's been the constant mental calculation going on. Whereas now, depending on the book, obviously, but oftentimes I'll just be reading along and then all of a sudden I'll be like, I don't know what that word means. And that's more similar to how my experience in English is. Like, if I see a word that I don't know when I'm reading in English, I'm like, oh, I don't know what that means. Obviously, again, depending on the type of book, but just a normal fiction book. And still, my Spanish vocabulary is nowhere near my English vocabulary, and sadly, I have to kind of confront the reality that it may never be, because I have an entire lifetime of reading in English behind me, but anyway. So that's a fun thing. Another fun thing is sometimes I will be doing things online. Often I will be doing things online, and I will be just wading through a website or whatever, and I'll realize, oh, this is in Spanish. Because my phone is set to Spanish, so any website or app that has Spanish available as an option is in Spanish, and so I'll just be I was using Hello Chinese the other day, and I just realized 3 minutes into using it that it's in Spanish, all the explanations are in Spanish, and I just didn't even notice. I was just understanding them, and it was just normal to me. I did ask on Instagram about any other milestones or anything to bring up, and Victoria from Study Notepad had asked how I feel about dreaming in target languages, and I am a weird person to ask here because I don't want to say I don't dream, because I do, I'm sure I do if I'm getting REM sleep at all, but I almost never remember dreaming. When I do, I don't have speech in my dreams. There are not words in my dreams, I don't think, ever. I did have very, very detailed dreams when I was a kid, not to get too deep, but I had chronic nightmares for a decade, and then I think my brain was just no more dreaming for you, you don't we're just not doing that. We're turning that feature off. And so, yeah, normally I just wake up feeling like I was just in a cloak of darkness for 8 hours. So no, I have not dreamt in Spanish, and I don't expect myself to ever dream in any target languages because I don't dream in English. So yeah, I always feel like obligated to put a disclaimer in here, like the number of things that I do in Spanish, like reading and watching TV and stuff. Like, I know that some people put pressure on themselves or like compare. There was this clip of the girl that's in the show The Bear or whatever, the show about the chef. She was like, I just watch TV. I don't have any hobbies or whatever. Like, that's how I feel when I'm talking about these things, because, you know, I don't have kids. I don't have like a lot of responsibilities other than keeping myself alive and going to work. And so like reading is like my number one escape from the world. I also love to watch TV, and I, you know, now I'm at the stage where I can watch TV and clean or do other things at the same time. So I just pretty much always have my iPad and my little TV shows going. And so that is a huge privilege that I have the time and the availability to do all of this stuff, not to mention access to platforms on which to read and watch things. Anyway, I just wanted to mention that because I don't want anyone to feel like they need to be doing this much. Like, rest assured, this is pretty much all I do. Yeah. I just wanted to have like a little timeline of my Spanish learning, and hopefully this will be beneficial to someone. You know, it may seem like a long time of learning to you. It may seem like no time at all. It seems like both of those things to me. So, but yeah, I will see you in the next video.